It's Christmas Eve, 2010 in Tunisia. In a few weeks, the North African country will erupt into revolution and the world's cameras will turn toward it. But that is still to come. For now, the country is uneasy and distracted. And in one northern city, a 10-year-old boy goes out to play in the afternoon and does not come home. Uncovering what happened to him will take 4 years, and the horrible truth, when it is revealed, will rest on a reason almost no one is prepared to believe. Rabbi Nefati was 10 years old, an ordinary, active schoolboy living with his family in the city of Menzel-Bourguiba in Tunisia's Bizerta region. He was a bright child in year 5, still small for his age, with a shy smile and an earnest love of football. His hometown is a working-class city about an hour north of Tunis, known mostly for its naval dockyard and bustling markets. It's the kind of close-knit community where children play freely in the streets and neighbors know each other by name. Rabbi's parents adored him. They watched over their only son as best they could, but in late 2010, Tunisia was in turmoil. Protests and political upheaval were sweeping the country. Amid that chaos, tragedy struck Rabbi's family on Christmas Eve. On December 24th, 2010, Rabbi vanished without a trace. It was the middle of the afternoon when he went missing. One moment he was playing near his parents' house. The next, he was simply gone. His mother realized something was wrong when dusk fell and Robbie hadn't come home. The Nefati family frantically searched the neighborhood, knocking on doors and calling his name up and down the streets. As minutes turned into hours, fear set in. They contacted the police, and soon a broader search effort was underway. Officers and volunteers combed through alleys, abandoned lots, and the surrounding countryside late into the night and over the next several days. People feared the worst. Rabbi's photograph was circulated, and local radio mentioned the missing boy. Strangers joined the search, hoping to find him safe. But each day that passed with no news made those hopes dwindle. Exactly 1 week later, on New Year's Day, the search ended in the worst way imaginable. Rabbi's body was discovered dumped in farmland about 10 miles outside the city. The news hit Menzel-Bourguiba hard. Families who had prayed for the boy's safe return now wept at the details of his fate. Police at the scene could barely stomach what they found. Rabbi's small corpse had been stuffed into a plastic feed sack and left in an open field amid winter weeds. When forensic officers opened the bag, they saw that the child had been savagely butchered. The coroner would later count over 30 stab wounds across Rabbi's torso. His throat had been slit so viciously that he was nearly decapitated. Congealed blood matted his clothes and skin. There were signs of strange cuts and mutilation that did not fit any ordinary pattern of homicide. It looked more like an animal slaughter or some macabre ritual than a straightforward crime. Seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend the scene. Who would slit a boy's throat and stab him dozens of times, then leave him in a sack like garbage? Was this the work of a deranged killer? A pedophile? Some occult practice? The community demanded answers, and police vowed to find whoever was responsible for this monstrous act. Rabbi's parents, devastated by grief, were in disbelief that anyone could hurt their gentle son in such a way. At the morgue, his mother was kept from seeing the worst injuries, but even the knowledge was enough to break her. In her anguish, she began to suspect that this was not a random atrocity at all, but something personal. As family members gathered around the distraught parents, Rabbi's mother expressed a shocking suspicion. She believed some of her own relatives could be involved in her son's murder. Specifically, she pointed the finger at one of Rabbi's aunts and the aunt's husband. This aunt was the mother's own sister, and bad blood ran between them. The two sisters had been feuding for years over an inheritance and other family disputes. There had been arguments, resentments, even threats exchanged. Rabbi's mother now recalled that her sister and brother-in-law harbored real animosity towards her. In her gut, she felt they wanted revenge, and that harming Rabi might have been the cruelest way to get it. It sounded almost unthinkable, accusing a child's aunt and uncle of such a heinous crime. Other relatives were skeptical, emotions were high, and grief was clouding reason. But in the first days of the investigation, this desperate mother insisted to police that they look closely at that particular branch of the family. The aunt in question, let's call her Sonia, was a woman in her late 30s, married with children of her own. Rabi knew her well as a relative he saw at occasional gatherings. Sonia and her younger sister, Rabi's other aunt, whom we'll call Iqbal, had never been fond of Rabi's mother. In fact, both aunts had been estranged from her after a bitter falling out. The feud stemmed from an inheritance dispute that left lasting scars within the family. Sonia especially blamed her sister for what she believed was a financial betrayal, and she had vowed at one point to settle the score. These were heated words spoken in anger years before. No one took them literally at the time. Now, in the light of Rabi's murder, those old threats loomed suddenly large and sinister. Rabi's mother remembered something else chilling. In the weeks before his disappearance, Sonia's husband Jilani had been behaving oddly around Rabi. Jilani was Rabi's uncle by marriage, a quiet man in his 40s, working odd jobs around town. A neighbor had seen Jilani taking Rabi out for a drive a few days before the boy vanished. At the time it seemed harmless. He was family after all, perhaps just spending time with his nephew. But now that innocent outing looked suspicious. Why had Jilani been with Rabi shortly before he went missing? What were they doing? Investigators followed up on these leads quickly, even as forensic work on the body continued. The autopsy confirmed that Rabi had died from the brutal knife wound to his neck. There was no evidence of sexual assault or typical abuse. In fact, aside from the frenzy of stabbings and cuts, the boy's body showed none of the patterns seen in crimes like kidnapping for ransom or crimes by pedophiles. It was as if his killer's sole intent was to spill as much of the child's blood as possible. This was the first real indication that something ritualistic or symbolic might be at play. Some officers theorized it could be an occult sacrifice. In Tunisia, as in many places, there are whispered tales of black magic and folk rituals, but it's exceedingly rare to see them manifest in a murder. Still, a few older detectives recalled past cases and legends. Hidden treasure sought through witchcraft, healers who used blood in ceremonies, so-called zar or sorcery rites. Could Rabi have been killed as part of some horrifying witchcraft ritual? It seemed far-fetched, but they could not ignore the possibility. With that in mind, the family accusations took on new meaning. If Aunt Sonia and Uncle Jilani truly bore ill will toward Rabi's mother, could they have been involved in something like this? Police brought Jilani in for questioning within days of the body's discovery. They also interviewed both of Rabi's aunts. The three denied any involvement. Sonia bristled at the suggestion that she would ever harm her nephew. She acknowledged the feud with her sister, but called the very idea insane. Jilani likewise claimed he had nothing to do with Rabi's disappearance. Yes, he admitted, he had once taken the boy out for a short drive the week before. He said he'd treated Rabi to a soda at a cafe outside town and then dropped him home. Just a friendly outing, he insisted. Investigators had no proof otherwise. There were no eyewitnesses placing them together on the day of the kidnapping, December 24th. There was no forensic evidence tying Jilani or the aunts to the crime. No fingerprints on the bag, no DNA under Rabi's fingernails besides his own. It was frustrating. The mother's intuition and circumstantial hints were not enough to hold a suspect, let alone charge one with murder. After hours of interrogation, Jilani and the two aunts were released. They remained persons of interest, but at that point the case was wide open, and there simply wasn't evidence to arrest anyone. Rabi's family was heartbroken and growing angry. To them, it felt like murderers were walking free, maybe even within their own family, but nothing was being done. The police, for their part, were under intense pressure to solve the case, yet every lead seemed to dead end. The investigation stretched on through early 2011 with little progress. Complicating matters, Tunisia was undergoing historic turbulence at the very same time. The revolution that began in January 2011 threw the country's institutions including law enforcement, into temporary disarray. In the chaos of regime change, a single small city murder case, however tragic, did not get the sustained attention it needed. Months turned into years. Rabi's murder case went largely cold. A new investigative judge was assigned and reassigned. Other, more recent crimes took priority. But Rabi's parents never stopped pressing for justice. They were convinced they knew who was responsible, even if they couldn't prove it. And they were not entirely wrong. Behind the scenes, events were gradually aligning that would vindicate the mother's suspicions in the most bizarre way. The man she suspected, Jilani, her sister's husband, had returned to ordinary life after being briefly detained and released. If he was involved in the murder, he may have thought he had gotten away with it. But Jilani's conscience was not at ease. In 2012, about a year after Rabi's death, Jilani ran into trouble with the law for a different matter. He was arrested and convicted on an unrelated criminal charge. Sources later described it only as a financial crime, or a fraud, not violent in nature. He was given a short prison term and sent to serve time at a penitentiary in northern Tunisia. It seemed unrelated to the Nafati case, but that twist of fate proved crucial. Locked in a cell night after night, Jilani could not escape his own thoughts. The other inmates noticed he was a quiet, tense man. One cellmate in particular grew concerned. This cellmate's name was Abdel Sattar, a small-time offender doing time for petty theft. Abdel later recounted that Jilani would talk in his sleep. In the dark of their shared cell, Abdel often woke to the sounds of Jilani thrashing and mumbling. One name kept coming out of Jilani's mouth during these fitful nightmares. Rabi. Rabi. The cellmate, perplexed, finally confronted Jilani about it. Why was he calling out the name of a child in his sleep? At first, Jilani waved it off. But as weeks passed, the nightmares continued. Abdel noticed Jilani would wake up terrified and shaky after these episodes. It was as if some horror was pressing on his conscience. Sensing that his cellmate was burdened by a terrible secret, Abdel gently but persistently urged Jilani to talk. The older man at last broke down. Late one night, under the flickering neon light of the cell, Jilani confessed to Abdel what was haunting him. He admitted that he had played a role in the murder of little Rabi Nafati. It all came tumbling out in a hushed, urgent whisper. The boy's abduction on that December day, the horrific way they killed him, and most astonishing of all, the reason why they did it. Jilani told his cellmate that he and his accomplices murdered the child as part of a grotesque ritual, a blood sacrifice meant to unearth a hidden treasure. They believed Rabi was a special child whose spilled blood could unlock riches buried beneath the earth. In Jilani's own words, they killed Rabi to make a treasure emerge from his body. Hearing this, Abdel Sattar sat in stunned silence. The story was almost beyond belief. Jilani went on to name names. His own wife, Rabi's aunt, and her sister were in on the plan. So was Jilani's adult son from a previous marriage. And the entire plot had been set in motion by a so-called sorcerer, a self-proclaimed treasure finder who had travelled from Morocco to guide them. This Moroccan magician had convinced the family that a fortune lay hidden somewhere in the region, guarded by supernatural forces, and that only the ritual blood of a pure child, a child like Rabi, would reveal its location. North African folklore has a term for children who are supposedly marked by destiny to locate treasure. They're called Zuri children. According to superstition, a Zuri child can commune with spirits, or jinn guarding ancient treasure troves. The catch is that the child's blood must be shed to break the spiritual curse and free the gold. It's an appalling legend, and in modern times nearly everyone dismisses it as a vile fairy tale. But there remains an underworld of charlatans and fortune seekers who take it deadly seriously. Jilani's cellmate realized he was hearing a genuine confession of a ritual murder rooted in this archaic belief. He was horrified and also terrified. Abdel later admitted that in that moment he feared for his own safety, locked in a cell with a man who could murder a child for such a reason. But Jilani, having unburdened himself, seemed exhausted, even relieved. He made his cellmate swear never to breathe a word of it. He claimed he wasn't in his right mind when it happened, that he had been blinded by greed and anger stirred up by the sorcerer. He whispered that he regretted it deeply, but had felt trapped, both by the scheme and by his vengeful wife, who he said had pushed and pushed for something terrible to happen to her sister's family. Abdel said nothing more that night. He lay awake, trembling, until dawn. In the days that followed, he wrestled with what to do. He was an inmate after all, not exactly in a position to go to the police immediately. If he informed the prison authorities, would they even believe him? And if word got back to Jilani that he'd betrayed his confidence, Abdel's life could be in danger behind bars. So he held on to the secret, counting the days until his own release. Eventually, Abdel completed his sentence and walked free. By then it was 2013, and Rabi's murder investigation was a cold file. Abdel, newly released, saw that no one had been charged for that heinous crime. He knew who was responsible. They were out there, unpunished. Still, he hesitated. Speaking up as an ex-convict, accusing a whole group of people based on a jailhouse confession, could drag him back into a mess. For a while he kept silent, hoping perhaps that the killers would slip up on their own and justice would be done without him. Months went by. Then fate intervened again, this time through an unlikely source. Reality television. In 2014, Rabi's grieving family made a bold move to reignite public attention on the case. They approached a popular Tunisian TV program, which roughly translates to "Forgiveness is noble." The show specialized in reconciling people or revealing hard truths in front of a live studio audience. In an episode that year, Rabi's mother and father appeared on the program. They had invited none other than Jilani, the very man she had suspected, to join them on stage. The producers framed it as an attempt to resolve a painful family rift. Under the studio lights, with cameras rolling, Rabi's mother confronted Jilani about the murder of her son. She pleaded for him to tell her what had really happened. Jilani, caught off guard in front of an audience of millions, vehemently denied any involvement. He insisted on his innocence, even swore that he loved Rabi like his own child. The exchange was emotional and tense. Rabi's parents broke down in tears, accusing Jilani and his wife of knowing more than they admitted. Jilani protested and held fast to his denials. By the end of the segment, no confession had been extracted, but the spectacle made headlines. Viewers across Tunisia saw this family drama play out, and tongues began to wag again in Menzil Bourguiba. Could the Nefati murder really have been an inside job? One of those television viewers, as it turned out, was Abdel Sattar, Jilani's former cellmate. When he saw Jilani's face on the TV screen, flanked by Rabi's sobbing parents, he felt his heart skip a beat. Here was the man who had confessed a murder on those sleepless prison nights, now publicly denying the crime. Abdel realized he could no longer stay silent. The very next day, he contacted the authorities. He told the police everything, the nightmares, Jilani's whispered confession about the blood treasure ritual, and the names of all the accomplices that he could remember. Investigators were stunned by the information. It was the break they desperately needed, albeit an unconventional one. The case of Rabi Nefati was suddenly very much alive again. Acting on Abdel's tip, the public prosecutor of Bizerte swiftly issued arrest warrants. In short order, police detained Jilani for the second time, along with his wife and her sister. Jilani's adult son, a young man in his 20s, was also arrested. He was said to have been involved in the plot from start to finish under his father's direction. The fifth suspect, the so-called sorcerer from Morocco, proved more elusive. Investigators identified him through Jilani's statements as a man who had presented himself as a treasure finder, sometimes called a marabout. This man had travelled to Tunisia and met the group in late 2010, but by the time the conspiracy came to light, he had long since fled. He was believed to have slipped back across the border into Algeria or returned to Morocco. Even without the sorcerer physically in custody, the prosecutor moved forward with charges against all 5 individuals. It was an extraordinary and disturbing case. 5 people, including 2 aunts of the victim, accused of plotting and murdering an innocent child in a grotesque act of superstition-fueled greed. With suspects now in hand, the investigation was able to fill in the missing pieces of what happened to Rabi. Under questioning by the new investigative judge, Jilani at first tried to play down his role, but confronted with his own cellmate's testimony and likely realizing that his co-conspirators might also talk, he eventually cooperated. Over several sessions, Jilani described the unbelievable sequence of events that led to Rabi's death. It matched what he had told Abdel Sattar in prison, with even more detail. He explained that he, his wife, and her sister had been seduced by the idea of hidden treasure. It started with rumors of an old Ottoman cache of gold supposedly buried somewhere outside the city. They were introduced to the Moroccan sorcerer through a friend of a friend. This man claimed to be an expert in locating lost treasures via spiritual means. When the two aunts and Jilani met him, the sorcerer spun a compelling tale. Yes, a treasure was buried nearby, but an evil spirit guarded it. The only way to appease the spirit and release the fortune was to perform a blood sacrifice. Specifically, the sacrifice of a Zuri child. According to their statements, the aunts then proposed a target, their own nephew, Rabi. He was accessible, they reasoned. More chillingly, Sonia voiced that hurting Rabi would also hurt her estranged sister, killing two birds with one stone, as it were. It's not clear if they truly believed Rabi had some special Zuri quality, or if they simply convinced themselves he did to justify the unspeakable. But once the idea took root, the 5 conspirators began preparing. They obtained digging tools, shovels, and large quantities of incense and candles for the ritual, items later recovered from Jilani's property. The Moroccan sorcerer chose what he thought was a likely treasure site, a remote plot of land in the area of Maghrawa, about 17 kilometers from Menzel Bourguiba. By late December 2010, everything was set. On the afternoon of December 24th, Jilani lured Rabi away. The boy trusted his uncle and likely went with him willingly, possibly on the promise of a holiday treat or a short trip to see something interesting. Jilani drove Rabi out of the city toward the fields where the others were already waiting. The aunts, Sonia and Iqbal, were there, as were Jilani's son and the sorcerer. It was still daylight when Rabi arrived at the secluded spot, but it was quiet and empty, no witnesses for miles. One can only imagine the boy's confusion and growing fear as he was led to the chosen place. At the site, according to Jilani's confession, the sorcerer began an occult ritual. He lit incense and muttered incantations in a mix of Arabic and mystic phrases. The adults drew symbols on the ground. Rabi would have been terrified. In the final moments, it appears that all 5 conspirators participated directly or indirectly in killing the boy. Jilani admitted to holding Rabi down. His son helped. One of the women produced a long knife, and then, in a frenzy of warped determination, they cut Rabi's throat. The sorcerer insisted they had to spill a great deal of blood, so the group stabbed the child again and again as his life ebbed away. It is difficult to fathom how anyone, much less family members, could carry out such an atrocity. But in the cool, bureaucratic language of the later court documents, it was described as a premeditated act, a human sacrifice intended to invoke supernatural help. Rabi died there on the cold ground, surrounded by people he had once known as aunt or uncle, none of whom showed him mercy in his final moments. After the murder, the charlatan instructed them to wait, to look for a sign of the treasure's emergence. Perhaps he promised that the earth would open or some omen would appear signaling where to dig. The 5 stood there, splattered with the blood of an innocent child, peering at the empty field for a miracle that would not come. Of course, nothing happened. There was no treasure, no spirit offering gold. Realizing the horror of what they'd done and seeing no payoff at all, panic began to set in. The sorcerer grew agitated. According to Jilani, the Moroccan man cursed them for bungling the ritual somehow and fled almost immediately, vanishing into the night. Now the remaining 4 conspirators were left with a murdered child's body and no plan. They knew they had to cover their tracks. The 2 aunts and Jilani wrapped Rabi's corpse in an old plastic sack. a makeshift solution to transport and hide it. Under cover of darkness, they dragged the bundle a short distance and dumped it at the edge of the field among some bushes. Perhaps they hoped wild animals would scavenge it beyond recognition, or that no one would ever find the poor boy out there. In their haste, they left behind some ritual items, burnt incense, footprints in the dirt. But by the time Rabi's body was discovered a week later, rains had washed away many clues. The killers then tried to resume normal life, as if they hadn't just committed an unspeakable crime. They even mingled with family during the initial search for Rabi, feigning worry and innocence. Sonia and Iqbal comforted their grieving sister in the days before Rabi's body was found, playing the part of heartbroken aunts. For 4 years, these terrible secrets stayed buried. It was only thanks to the chance pairing of Jilani with a curious cellmate and the courage of that cellmate to come forward that the truth finally emerged. By 2014, with the suspects in custody and confessions on record, prosecutors felt they had a solid case. The trial of the 5 defendants began in early 2015 in the Bizerta Criminal Court. It was a trial that riveted Tunisia. The sheer brutality of the crime and the bizarre motive made for lurid headlines. The most damning evidence, of course, was the defendant's own words. Abdel Sattar, the cellmate, testified to what Jilani had told him in prison. Then Jilani's formal confession was introduced. Initially, Jilani had tried to retract some of his statements, claiming that he was not of sound mind when he spoke to the police. But as the trial went on, confronted with all evidence, he ultimately acknowledged his role again on the stand. Voice trembling, he told the judges, "I did it, but I was not myself. I was under a kind of spell. I thought we would get rich. I swear I wouldn't have done it otherwise." It was a pitiable attempt to shift blame, painting himself as a man tricked by black magic and an angry wife. The 2 aunts, for their part, mounted a defense of minimization. Sonia testified that the sorcerer had overpowered them all with witches' tricks, and that she and her sister merely helped dispose of the body after the men killed Rabi. Iqbal sobbed on the stand and said she thought it was all just going to be a ceremony, and that she didn't believe the sorcery talk until it was too late. She insisted she never laid a hand on her nephew. The judges did not find these portrayals convincing. They had evidence that both women were deeply involved from the start. After all, if the aunts hadn't intended violence, why had they procured the sack and cleaning materials in advance? Jilani's son, a young man named Murad, sat quietly through most of the trial. He gave only a brief statement, claiming that he acted out of obedience to his father and that he was horrified by what happened. But even he could not avoid culpability. He had bound Rabi's hands, according to Jilani's confession. He had stood watch as the slaughter took place. The judges regarded him as fully complicit. Lastly, there was the Moroccan sorcerer, absent but not forgotten. He was tried in absentia, meaning the court heard evidence against him despite his fugitive status. Even without him present, the judges were satisfied that he had instigated the crime by exploiting the other's superstition and envy. In February 2015, the Bizerte First Instance Tribunal delivered its verdict. All 5 defendants were found guilty of premeditated murder. It was a capital offence under Tunisian law. The chief judge pronounced the sentence, death for each of the 5 by hanging. Jilani stood pale and did not react outwardly. His wife Sonia collapsed onto a bench, wailing, "No, no." Iqbal fainted and had to be carried out. Murad stared at the floor, unblinking, as if in a daze. The 5th sentence, for the absent Moroccan, was largely symbolic. A notice to the world that if he were ever caught, he too would face the ultimate punishment. In March 2016, the appellate court upheld all 5 convictions and the death sentences. The case then went to the highest judicial level, the Court of Cassation. In 2021, a decade after Rabi's murder, the convictions were confirmed once and for all. Yet for all the talk of execution, the reality in Tunisia is that the death penalty is effectively under a moratorium. The country has not carried out an execution since the early 1990s. Death sentences continue to be handed down, especially for brutal murders, but they are invariably commuted to life imprisonment or left unenforced. Rabi's parents were well aware of this, and it pained them. In media interviews in 2018, they expressed frustration, calling the court's decision just and fair, but imploring the state to actually carry it out. "Let them be executed," Rabi's father said on one radio program, voice trembling with emotion. "Let the punishment our son's killers earned be done, so that his soul can rest." He and his wife argued that if any case deserved an end to the moratorium, it was this one, the murder of a child under such horrific circumstances. Their plea garnered sympathy, but Tunisia's policy did not change. The 5 convicted killers remained on death row, their sentences essentially converted to life behind bars. As of today, all 4 captured conspirators are serving out their interminable prison days. The Moroccan sorcerer, the 5th condemned, is still a fugitive, his whereabouts unknown. Perhaps he continues his deceitful trade elsewhere. Perhaps he has quietly faded into obscurity under a false identity. The murder of Rabi Nefati is a tale almost too terrible to be true. A family betrayed from within, a child sacrificed on the altar of greed and superstition, and a treasure that never existed. In the end, the only thing unearthed was the truth, and with it, a sorrow that will haunt those involved for the rest of their lives. Thanks so much for listening. If you're interested in rarely heard solved global murder cases, consider giving us a follow. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we'd be thrilled if you would give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. It really helps us a lot. See you next time.